I am having Roland Grabner with us today, as I've been based in Austria for a lot of for 12 years, and he has just become a professor in the University of Graz, and what he's doing there, he is looking at the neuroscience at the basis of how children learn maths, and he has a connection with chess because a couple of years ago he made quite an interesting study on chess and intelligence. And intelligence used to be his focus. Now it's more on learning and creativity. And please, Roland, are you ready?
I'm ready, yes.
Beautiful. Let's go.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting meeting. As I said, I conducted my PhD on the interplay between intelligence and expertise. And the domain of expertise we chose for this research was, of course, chess, because it's the most interesting expertise domain, actually. And after my PhD, I've moved my research interest into mathematics learning. And here I'm particularly interested into the neural mechanisms underlying typical and atypical development of mathematical skills. So the present meeting, of course, is then very special to me because it allows me to bring together both of my research interests. And this is also one aim of the present talk. Actually, I would like to give you a brief overview of current evidence on successful math learning from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience, and then also try to link this research with investigations on chess performance. So, generally, my research can be located in the comparably novel research field called educational neuroscience. And the aim of this research field is actually to link cognitive neuroscience and education, or more specifically, to gain further insights into the mechanisms of successful learning by also looking into the brain, using methods such as magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, or transcranial electrical stimulation. And using these methods, not only the input and output of learning processes can be investigated, of course, but also what happens during learning in the brain. In the past 5 to 10 years, this research field has tremendously grown. This is, for instance, reflected in the number of publications, which showed a tremendous increase since 2005, as you can easily see here. And one reason for this growth can be seen in the large increase of research interest into mathematics learning. And in fact, mathematics learning is now one of the major topics in this research field. And this may be due to the rising awareness that mathematical skills are of equal importance for educational and occupational success as literacy. And therefore, the aim of cognitive neuroscience is to advance our understanding on the neural mechanisms underlying typical and atypical development that result in a broad range of mathematical skills, from learning disorders up to higher expertise in mathematics. And in this talk, I would like to talk about these mechanisms and what we currently know from cognitive neuroscience about them. In particular, I would like to present some findings on magnitude processing on the one hand, and symbol and pattern processing on the other hand. And after that, I would like to discuss potential links from cognitive neuroscience and math learning to chess performance. So let's start with the first point, the neurocognitive mechanisms of math learning. In 1997, a very famous researcher, Stanislas Dehaene, wrote a book entitled Number Sense. And in this book he highlighted that we are all endowed with the innate ability to quickly understand and approximate numerical magnitudes. So when you look at, for instance, at these two pictures, and I ask you which of these two pictures show more apples on the tree, you can immediately answer this question. And you can immediately answer this question without deliberately counting the apples. You can see it at first sight that the left tree shows more apples than the right tree. And this basic ability to compare and to contrast numerical magnitudes is already found in infants, and also other animals such as non-human primates, birds, amphibians, fish, and so on. So, we are all endowed with a basic number sense, with the ability to understand and approximate numerical quantities, an ability that we share with other species. Against this background, of course, there has been a large research interest into how numerical magnitude is represented and processed in the human brain. Here, it's a simple number or magnitude comparison task. So participants were presented with two quantities and simply had to decide on which side the larger quantity is. So for instance, in these three examples, it's always on the right side. A very basic task. This task was first administered in the 1960s and actually led to a finding that was interesting enough to be published in the high-ranking journal Nature. This simple number comparison task depended on the numerical distance of the two magnitudes that have to be compared. So for instance, in this example, the numerical distance is 1 because there are 3 and 4 dots, as you can see. Here the numerical distance is 3, here it is 6. So the smaller the numerical distance of the two magnitudes is, the longer it took the participants to decide on which side the larger quantity is depicted. So, for instance, if you compare these two magnitudes, it takes you significantly longer than if you compare these two magnitudes. This effect has been replicated several times and has meanwhile become known as the numerical distance effect. And the reason for this effect is currently seen in the representation of different numbers in the brain. Concretely, it is assumed that the numbers are presented along a mental number line, and that the representation of each number is noisy, for instance, as depicted here. If you have to compare two numbers that are further apart on this mental number line, like 3 and 9, their representations don't show a large overlap, so you can easily discriminate them. However, if you have to compare numbers that are very close together, their representations show a large overlap, and it takes you much longer to decide where the larger number is, the larger quantity is. And this area plays an important role also in calculation and whenever you have to deal with numerical magnitudes. Further studies revealed the importance of this core quantity region also for the successful development of mathematical skills. If this region does not work normally, the development seems to be impaired. So, for instance, it has been found in children who suffer from mathematical learning disabilities that this brain region does not show the typical activation pattern. In this study, for instance, children were presented with such number comparison tasks, and it was found that in the healthy controlled children, the typical result pattern emerged. So numbers with a small distance show a larger activation here in this brain region. Numbers with a large distance show smaller activation. And when you look at the dyscalculic children, so the children with math learning disabilities, you can see that the IPS is not modulated by numerical distance. So the IPS does not seem to care about the numerical magnitudes. This is also reflected in the performance, and this is also assumed to be one cause of their poor mathematical skills. So since you know about the distance effect now, I can tell you a recent but quite intriguing finding that is related to the presentation format of this task. Number comparison tasks can be presented like that, so using dots for instance, or other shapes to present magnitudes. Or you can of course also present number symbols, Arabic digits for instance. And the interesting point is that only the performance in this symbolic number comparison task is consistently related to mathematical development. So you have a less consistent relationship between the performance in the non-symbolic number comparison task and math skills compared to the symbolic number comparison task. And this holds true for typically as well as atypically developing children. So those children who can deal better with the number symbols, who can understand these number symbols better, also show better performance in other mathematical tasks. And children with mathematical learning disabilities particularly have problems in these tasks and less problems in these tasks. So consequently, it doesn't seem to be the quantity processing per se that is especially important for mathematical development, but rather the ability to understand and to process the symbolic number presentations. In light of this finding, of course, also here the question arises, which brain region links the number symbols on the one hand with the magnitude representations in the brain, which are assumed to be located in the intraparietal sulcus. And this can be quite easily investigated by just presenting participants with these two types of tasks and look at those brain regions to show a stronger activation whenever number symbols are involved. This has been done, for instance, in this study. And this study has revealed, and other studies have revealed, that one brain region seems to be particularly important for the symbolic number processing, and it's depicted here, and it's called the angular gyrus. It's just beneath the intraparietal sulcus, as you can see here. Because it seems to play an important role not only in basic number processing, but for mathematical skills in general. And this turned out in several of our studies, which focused on mathematical competencies in adults, more specifically individual differences in mathematical competencies in adults. So we conducted a range of studies where we asked the question of how do adults of lower and higher mathematical competencies differ in their brain activation while solving different mathematical problems. And to this end, we screened large samples of participants and then for each study carefully selected groups that only differed in their mathematical competencies but not in other abilities, to just be sure that what we see is related to math. In the first study on this topic, we presented the participants, the two competence groups, with arithmetic problems like multiplication problems depicted here, easier and more complex ones. They simply had to decide whether the equation is correct or whether it is not correct. In contrasting the two competence groups, of course we found that the more competent outperformed the less competent ones, but additionally we found that this performance advantage was associated with higher activation here in my favorite brain region, as you can see. And even more, the activation in this brain region displayed a linear relationship with the mathematical competence of the participant. So the higher the participant's mathematical numerical IQ was, the larger was the activation of the angular gyrus during this task. In subsequent studies, we used other tasks to investigate this question in the two competence groups. For instance, in this investigation, we used the representation matching task. Here, participants were presented with pairs of bar charts and symbolic equations and simply had to state whether both representations display the same numerical information or not. So they had to decide whether the magnitude of a specific bar has a certain value, whether the minimum or maximum has a certain value, or they had to perform an additional calculation. So more or less, rather independent of the exact nature of a mathematical task, we found that the individuals with higher mathematical competence displayed a higher activation in this brain region, as you already know, that's the angular gyrus. And they only differed in the end. And they differed only in the angular gyrus, actually. So these findings suggest that the function of the angular gyrus is not only restricted to basic number processing or to linking number symbols to the magnitude representation in the brain, but rather that it supports a more general process that is important for mathematics. And at present, we assume that the angular gyrus maps all overlearned symbols and symbolic configurations, symbolic patterns, to the semantic knowledge in our brain. So this holds true, of course, for the number symbols, but also this holds true for overlearned symbolic chunks or symbolic configurations. So for instance, from these examples from the multiplication tables, you have really learned them very well in school, and when I ask you the question 2 times 2, you immediately know it's 4. You don't have to calculate, it just pops into your mind. So there's a very strong link between the symbolic representation outside more or less, and your knowledge inside. And the same may hold true also for any other equation where there is high expertise with, where you're very familiar with, which is really Roland. So to sum up this part, cognitive neuroscience research and mathematics has revealed that accurate magnitude processing, and even more, the automatic processing of symbols and symbolic patterns, are essential skills in the development of mathematical competences. And the finding that adults of different levels of mathematical competence differ in the activation of the angular gyrus provides first evidence that this symbol and pattern processing also looms large in higher order mathematical skills. Now I would like to move on and share some evidence and thoughts about links to chess, if there are any. So actually there are. Our first observation that there is an association between math learning and chess was made during one of my PhD studies. The aim of this study was to find out which variables could best predict the attained playing strength in chess, so the EDA rating in chess. And to this end, we investigated a comparably large sample of tournament players, as you can see here, with a very broad range of playing strength. Previous studies especially left the question open whether there is a relationship between chess playing strength and intelligence. Therefore, we were particularly interested whether there is one and looked at different facets of intelligence here. And this slide depicts the main results. Actually, we found that there is a relationship between intelligence and chess expertise. If you look at these charts here, these are so-called scatter plots. On the x-axis, you can see the IQ of the participants. On the y-axis, the ELO rating, and each dot represents one of these players in the sample. And as you can see here, for instance, for numerical IQ, we found a strong correlation between chess expertise, as measured by ELO rating, and intelligence. So those participants with a higher numerical IQ also performed better in chess. So they had a higher ELO rating. And this relationship was strongest for the numerical mathematical IQ, followed by the verbal IQ, and there was absolutely no relationship with figurative IQ. So actually, the latter finding was quite strange because we had expected that visual spatial processes, general visual spatial processes loom large, but in fact we found that especially mathematical numerical competence that is related to chess playing. Of course, the playing experience of the participants and the current number of tournament games were more important for the playing strength, but still numerical intelligence and only numerical intelligence incrementally contributed to the prediction of playing strength. So could this association, this relationship between math and chess skill be related? In a recent review article of neuroimaging studies conducted by my colleague Roland, it has been found that experts and novices differ in brain activation and horizon brain regions while solving different chess problems. Remarkably, some of these activation differences between experts and novices were found in these brain regions highlighted in the different colors. And you can immediately recognize that the green one and the blue one are at the same place where we found that for the mathematical competence, so in the angular gyrus. In one of these studies, for instance, that you can see what kind of tasks that were used, Larry Village and their colleagues asked the participants to perform 3 different tasks. So the representative task for chess was this check task. So participants had to detect as fast as possible whether the white king was in check. And they had 2 control tasks which were not so strongly related or not related to chess. So in the knight task, the participants simply had to decide if a knight of either color was on the board, and here in the dot task, if a dot of either color was on the board. The comparison of brain activity between experts and novices displayed a very interesting activation difference only in this check task. So in the task that is really related to chess playing, that is representative probably to chess playing. And it was specifically found that these brain regions here in the left hemisphere display higher activation during the check task in the experts compared to the novices. And one of these two brain regions is, as you can see, my favorite one. So this result was interpreted by the authors to be related to the chess experts' superior knowledge, of course, which allows them to automatically detect meaningful patterns on the board, which you probably, of course, also know from your own experience. So when presented with such a chess position, you don't have to identify the individual pieces and look at the relationship and analytically. You just see the patterns on the board. You see the symbolic configuration, its chunks, and you automatically retrieve the semantic knowledge that is related to that. And this processing of complex object configurations was related to the activation of these brain regions by these authors. Research on mathematics learning, an interesting idea emerges. It may be the case that the angular gyrus supports a similar cognitive process in both domains. And this process may be the automatic mapping of symbol configuration or symbols to the relevant semantic knowledge in the brain. And both mathematically more competent individuals and chess experts possess a larger knowledge base, have more experience with these patterns, and also display higher activation of this angular gyrus. So the mappings between the symbolic configurations and the knowledge seems to be stronger, which may be supported by this brain region. I personally find this assumption quite exciting, even though it's still highly speculative and needs to be tested systematically in future studies. This brings me to the end of my talk. The link between chess and math is not only the focus of the present meeting, and of course of high relevance for educational policy and practice. It's also a very appealing research topic in the quite novel research field of educational neuroscience. The idea of a common mechanism and common neurocognitive mechanism in mathematics and chess learning could be an initial step to bring together these two research fields in education and neuroscience, and also to gain further answers to the question of why it may be beneficial to bring chess to schools. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm also open for questions if there is still some time.
So last year we had a presentation about cognitive development comparing males and females. This year, I didn't hear you mention it, I might have missed it, but can you speak a little bit about male and female cognitive development in maths as well as chess?
Well, about the cognitive development in math, I have to say that there are not large differences, especially not from a neurocognitive perspective. So actually we don't find sex differences when we conduct these studies. So males and females show the same result pattern actually. There is no general difference between the two, between males and females here.